and public safety, and is eroding, if not cutting. It's just not increasing in accordance with inflation. A lot of programs like family services, domestic violence approaches, which is a bit surprising given if the government is serious about crime, then it should be taking a very serious look at domestic violence, because that is a huge element in crime and punishment in the territory. And so, if you like, we're in the middle of the electoral cycle. So next year's budget, notwithstanding the Treasurer's solemn comments about the level of our debt, will spend money big. Now, the political purposes of a budget, I don't quite share Sarah's enthusiasm or optimism about the accuracy of figures in budgets. So, they're highly inaccurate. There's a lot of expenditure, and I'm sure Martin would be familiar with this, that is put down for out years that will never occur. And one example, if you like, which is relevant to the bottom end of the territory, not the top end, is the National Aboriginal Art Gallery. Now, that's been on the budget for 3 or 4 years before it got cancelled. So there was always this constant promise that it was going to happen. Now, the political purpose of the budget, first, is symbolic satisficing. And I'll use tourism as an example here. The big issue in Central Australia is the Marina Loop Road. That's been on the budget papers as a capital expenditure for the last 10 years across successive governments. Always tiny bit of expenditure in the current year, but lots promised for the future years. And of course, the lots promised just gets moved on to the next lot of future years. So the tourism industry was bought off with 10 million grants, 10 million expenditure on tourism rather than the Marina Loop Road, which would cost a lot more, and 10 million in an upgrade of national parks, because people tend to be falling through the floors of latrines in national parks and territories. So it occurred to someone that you had to do something about them. So there's an element of electoral payoffs as well. Is another political strategy that's associated with budgets. And so we see, for instance, a small example is that Tennant Creek Hospital got a CT scanner. Now, that was, if you like, a particular minister saying we have to have something for Tennant Creek. So you've got these sorts of payoffs that occur. And also, finally, the budget is designed to manage expectations. And I think the comments about the deficit, I mean, there was some clever accounting a few years ago, a few budgets ago, that took our electricity utility off the utilities off the budget. Now, the utilities are going to have mounting expenses. Back in the 70s and 80s, when governments owned utilities, state governments used to mine their state electricity commissions for cash. Now we're in a situation where it's the opposite. The electricity utilities face huge debt problems down the road because they've got to basically redo all the grids in the major urban centres because persons with kind spirits and good hearts and a love for the earth, or at least the planet, are converting to solar and upsetting the demand structure in urban centres. So essentially I see any budget as just a political statement. So I take it about as seriously as a ministerial statement. It is a process that is designed to make things seem not necessarily what they are. Like, for instance, Indigenous education. you'll see very large amounts of expenditure. Now, some of that is Commonwealth money, but it doesn't portray the truth of how Indigenous education is funded. Now, let's assume, we'll take an example, if you like, a model, as economists would say, of a
just 1 minute to go.
Of a regional Indigenous school in a major community. It will have a budget of about $7 or $8 million. The school actually spends about a bit over half that, and the rest of it is clawed back to Darwin to pay for a bureaucracy that has 3 times the national average as a proportion of managers and administrators as any other public service in the country. So essentially the business of the Territory Government is to run the Territory Public Service. I think that's enough. I've been disgruntled.
That's a really great point about this massive public service sector that we've got. And yeah, that ties into those bigger questions about how can the NT survive? Is it possible to not be in debt and so forth? So it opens up a whole another line. But let's move on to, thank you very much. I made lots of notes there. Alan Buckingham, it's Dayna next, talking to us about her main takeaways for health in the NT budget and the priorities in the short, medium and long term for getting Territory Health back on track. Dayna's very organised and has got some great slides here for us.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thank you for the warm introduction. As Sarah said, my name is Dayna Duncan. I'm a doctor in the NT and I'm the Vice President for the top end of AMA NT. This is my 5th year working in the Territory, and I have been involved in medico-politics for longer than that as well. I'm speaking today on behalf of AMA Northern Territory, not on behalf of NT Health or any of my other employers. I'd also like to join Sarah in acknowledging the Larrakia people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm so lucky to live, work and play, and acknowledge the gap in health outcomes that are a result of persisting colonisation, but the huge strength that's shown by First Nations peoples all over the world and by Larrakia people in the face of this ongoing colonisation, the importance of two-way listening and learning to overcome this disparity. So I've got 3 key points that I'd like to speak to you about with the budget, and then a few general points at the end. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. I will do my best to answer them, but I am not an expert and I may take some of them on notice, but I will get back to you at some point. But first, I'd like to speak to you about primary health care. So this is an area near and dear to my heart, being a trainee in primary health. And the first thing I'd like to tell you about is why it matters so much. So there's a report that was done in 2020 that was led by the US Chamber of Commerce in partnership with countries around the world, being the Global Health Initiative for the Economy. And in Australia, this was the Victoria Institute. And the main takeaway that's often quoted, especially by the Royal Australian College of General Practice, is that for every $1 you spend in primary care, you save $13 in the hospital system. It's a slight misquote of the actual report itself, but the take-home message rings through in that it is one of the most cost-effective ways that you can invest in the health system to have economic outcomes as well as health outcomes for your community. And to take it back to an example from my day-to-day practice, in Aboriginal health, we do an annual health check, which is funded by Medicare once a year to do a comprehensive review of someone's health. And often we find problems that people didn't even know existed. So we'll diagnose hepatitis B or C, we'll diagnose heart disease or kidney disease, which is a passion and interest area of mine. And if we diagnose kidney disease early and start the right medications, we can delay someone from starting dialysis for up to 29 years. And dialysis costs millions. So delaying dialysis by 29 years is one of the biggest savings that you can make to the health system, but we can only do that early identification if we have a properly funded primary healthcare system. So what's in the budget? Alarmingly, a reduction in spending in primary healthcare overall by 1.5 million. And this is largely driven by a reduction in spending in remote primary healthcare and in community services, which is all of our wraparound allied health services like audiology, physiotherapy, occupational therapy, who are so important in early intervention for people who have these difficulties, especially young children, that makes that long-term outcome and has economic impacts as well as life and quality of life impacts. The one area that has gone up curiously is urban primary healthcare. And primary healthcare in general is a bit unusual in the Territory in that the convention is that primary healthcare is funded by the Commonwealth via Medicare, and hospitals and health services are funded by the states and territories. So in this area of the budget, there's actually more questions asked than there are answers raised. And my main question is, why are we paying for this? Why are we paying for primary healthcare? Why are we paying for urban primary healthcare when it's supposed to be delivered by the Commonwealth through Medicare? And I think a lot of this is to do with the fact that Medicare is so outdated. Medicare was designed for the 1950s healthcare system in terms of its technology, its functioning, its population, its health problems. It was not designed for 2026. And for more information on that, I direct you to the AMA's Modernise Medicare campaign, which is a federal campaign that lays out a very clear blueprint for updating Medicare to the health system and the health needs of our communities today. In addition to these specific reductions in spending in the primary healthcare space, there's also alarmingly been a reduction in disease prevention expenditure. So you can see, compared to the 2026 budget and actual, there is a significantly reduced spending. And disease prevention covers things like the vaccination rates, which currently are only 88% for 2-year-olds in the Northern Territory, as compared to our target of 92%. It covers our response to emerging viruses such as Murray Valley encephalitis, which we're seeing an increase on. We're seeing polio over in Western Australia. We're seeing diphtheria outbreak currently around the Territory, as well as the keratoconjunctivitis issue we had recently with the AFL players in the top end. So there is a lot going on in the public health space at the moment. And amidst all of that, they've reduced the funding for disease prevention, which is the most effective tool we have both economically and in terms of health and quality of life. It's also notable that mental health funding has gone down in the context of this, which in today's world is shocking, really, to see. So what would we do differently as the AMA if we were in charge of the budget? Immediately, we would ensure that there's no reduction in primary health funding. But in the long term, some really hard questions do need to be asked by the Territory government and ministers of the federal government, asking about why in the Territory we are expected to foot the bill for our primary healthcare service and for our retrieval service when it's an expectation and understanding that that's funded by the Commonwealth. That's meant to be federal funding, and it's draining our resources that could be better spent on shoring up our local health system, which deals with such a complexity that no other state or territory sees. There also needs to be at a federal level a discussion about modernising Medicare for our current health system and needs. Keep moving along, because I understand we're short on time. The second main concern is infrastructure. So all 5 hospitals in the NT are over 50 years old. RDH is bursting at the seams at all times, and the wait time in ED is seen not just as a result of the ambulances that are coming in or the people that are presenting, but the insufficient bed space on the ward and the insufficient community discharge destinations outside of that. So health infrastructure is essential, not just as an inpatient, but also outpatient services. And additionally, we've seen in Catherine Hospital, they were evacuated twice in a short period of time. Their ED is in desperate need of upgrades. Every single hospital in the NT is in need of infrastructure upgrades. What is in the budget? Out of a $45 billion spend on infrastructure, very little for health. So Tennant Creek, as was mentioned, has gotten a CT scanner, which is something that we've been campaigning for many, many years. So it's pleasing to see. In the long term, the ability to keep patients on country and take care of them in place will pay dividends in terms of culturally safe and appropriate care, but also health outcomes in reduction in delayed presentations, transport costs, needing to return for follow-up. And in addition to that $4 million for expenditure for the CT scanner itself, they've allocated $1 million for redesign of the building to accommodate it and also upgrade the operating theatres so that surgeons who are either based locally as GP rural generalist surgeons or fly in, fly out from Alice Springs can then take care of those patients who have had those CT scans in Tennant. The biggest area of concern in this area for us is the RDH morgue. So in 2023, the Labor government committed $20 million to upgrading the RDH morgue. We have a morgue. We also have a shipping container in our loading dock that is our overflow space for our morgue. We have 105 capacity in our morgue, and we're constantly using rented space at local funeral homes. The morgue is not fit for our current population. It has no culturally safe grieving area, and it's really just disappointing to see that we have such a need that we do have to have a backup option of a shipping container freezer sitting there in our loading bay just in case. So it is an issue that was identified and meant to be rectified in 2023, but we've lost to zero from that $20 million funding commitment for expansion of the morgue. They've committed $2 million to upgrades. That's really just urgent repairs, and $3 million for design of a culturally safe bereavement area. So really disappointing from us to see that that has been walked back when it was previously committed to by the Labor government, and then the CLP government had committed to uphold that funding. And while there has been some funding committed to the Alice Springs Hospital ambulatory care, this means that out of the total funding, a large portion of it is just about design. We're not actually delivering any infrastructure. We are designing and planning infrastructure. The glaring omission from this is the lack of funding for a new Royal Darwin Hospital, which we do desperately need. Our current hospital is quite literally falling apart during Cyclone Fina. They've shored it up as best they can, but it's not fit for purpose. It was not fit for purpose when it was built for the care needs of our community, and we do need a new Royal Darwin Hospital. There was not even a bit of seed funding in the budget, and that's what we really need. We need to get moving. It's a 7 to 10 year project. It's going to need to be heavily Commonwealth funded, but it needs to be territory driven and territory led. And then the third aspect that I wanted to speak on was staffing. So we can't have a NT health, or we can't have a health system without a health workforce. And there has been an increase in the funding projected from activity-based revenue, which is one of the main ways that we get funding to run our health system. But again, we can't generate activity, we can't generate activity-based revenue without staff. And there are two main Commonwealth services that have seen a significant decrease in funding. That's the Specialist Training Program, which funds the training of registrars who are training to be specialists, and that's various specialties, including GP and non-GP specialties. And the John Flynn Pre-Vocational Doctor Training Program, which has been renamed to another acronym, APCPP, which is about having pre-vocational doctors, so doctors in their first 2 years of training, going out to primary care and community-based placements. They can experience primary care and then be incentivized to train in primary care in the long term. Both of those have been heavily reduced. The STP has been reduced from 10 million to 5.1 million. So that's probably between 10 and 40 registrars fewer in the territory. And for the John Flynn, or the pre-vocational doctor program, has been reduced by 6.5 million. We have seen an increase in the employee expenses as covered by the Northern Territory government by 13 million, but that's for all health workforce, not just doctors. So it's not enough to overcome this reduction in Commonwealth funding, and it's something that we really need to think about in the territory. We need to grow our own workforce. We can't rely on importing from other states and other countries because we have such a unique health system with such unique health needs. We need to be growing our own to be sustainable, and we need to be growing our own to be culturally safe and appropriate in our care. So a few other key points just to touch on that were notable from the AMA and the budget. Two big red flags were Acacia. So the Acacia system, I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to read the submission that AMA NT made to the inquiry. There have been governance issues, systems issues, and functionality issues from day dot, to the point of compromising patient care in its original rollout. Thankfully, that was rolled back. The new version has been rolled out and is not unsafe, but it's not functional, and a lot more work is needed to make it a system that's actually functional for our health system. And the funding instead has been reduced. So we're at the worst case scenario, which is just to continue with the Acacia 1.0 only just functional system that we have, without substantial reforms or further upgrades or implementations. The second is NTG appropriation, which is our day-to-day funding for the actual health system and its running. Last year, we required $130 million of emergency funding. It's required this much and more many times before, but that again hasn't been budgeted in the actual budget. So it's going to be doled out in dribs and drabs throughout the year to create ribbon cutting ceremonies and press conferences, as opposed to just giving health the funding it needs upfront to do the job that it needs to do. There were a few really positive things to come out of that though, of the budget. So the first was funding to staff the new mental health ward. It is a bare minimum, but it's very pleasing to see. We have this beautiful new ward that you can see at the top that's under construction and projected to be finished perhaps towards the end of this year. So they have committed to funding the staffing for that ward, which is 18.3 million. And also, 16 million for the mental health ward, and the new general ward, which is called Ward 1C, which you can see on the bottom there, is nearing completion. And I believe they're expecting to have patients rolling into it in August, so quite soon. And they've committed to $16 million worth of staffing, which is great to see, desperately needed. But really, unless we fix the problems with primary care and with outflow from the hospital, simply having more beds isn't going to be the solution to the flow of patients through the health system, and also the prevention and holistic care that we need. So what does AMA-NT call for? We call for the government to stop playing political games with a $100 to $200 million operational shortfall and give health the money it needs upfront to do its job. To urgently committing to funding a new RDH. That's not funding in its entirety, that's funding the first bit, the design, the consultation, the work that needs to be done to work with the Commonwealth to get funding to build this. It's something that we have to do, and the longer we wait to do it, the more it's going to affect patient care and the more it's going to cost. So it's a 7 to 10 year project. We need to start yesterday. And then finally, to maintain funding for primary healthcare and have transparency on what this primary healthcare expenditure is and what the plans are long-term for creating a sustainable primary healthcare in the territory, because that is the most economically beneficial, but also the best thing that we can do in terms of health outcomes for Territorians. That was a whirlwind. I hope that was perhaps a bit interesting or helpful, and I very much look forward to your questions.
That was fantastically informative. Thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah, really interesting. And thanks for giving those numbers. It helps to, yeah, it really helped me to kind of see how certain elements are landing and the practical side. So thanks. All right. So over to you, Alan. Where are you? So Alan, you have got experience working in NT corrections in the finance side of things. So you're going to, I understand, talk to us a bit about this tough on crime approach, with this massive amount being spent on law and order. Is it value for money? Can the Territory afford it?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm going to talk about the police budget and the corrections budget, which are the two parts of the budget that relate to, as you call it, tough on crime. Now, I know it's the catch-call of the current government, but this process actually started with the Labor government back in 24-25 in their last year of government. They increased the police budget by about $90 million, which is a very large increase. And I suspect that was due as a way to try and beat the CLP, who were already campaigning at that time against tough on crime and a safety agenda. Well, when they came to government, CLP then increased it as about another 15 million. So over a 2-year period, the police budget has grown by over 30%. So we've heard how some of the other areas are being tightened up and there's not money. Well, there's certainly money in police and even more so in corrections. Over in the first budget this government brought down, there was more than a 30%, it was a nearly 34% increase in the budget, which, having worked in corrections, that's unheard of. It was always a very tight budget in the years that I was there, going back a few years, and that corresponds with their plan to incarcerate more people. Shortly after this new government came in, the incarceration rate jumped quite significantly by about 30% also, and about another 600 people were jailed in the territory in the latter part of last year. Now those numbers stand up still. So with all of these people put away, another 600 people not walking around committing these crimes, we'd all be very safe, wouldn't we? Well, I went back and had a look at the stats on crime, and I also wanted to compare it with the Australian results. Now, the trouble with the territory is that we're very small, and so for those of you who have got a statistical background, it's very hard to just compare 1 month to the next, because these numbers jump up and down, and you've got to look at long-term trends. The interesting thing for me when I started looking at these long-term trends was in Australia, crime is dropping overall across the country, and it's quite a steady downward graph over about the last 10 years. Whereas in the territory, I know the government stands up and they sort of cherry pick numbers. When they have a good month, they talk about how they're beating crime. But if you look at it overall, statistically, it's very hard to find any difference. Actually, it's pretty much the same. You know, statistically, that we've spent what is it? Well, last year it was 1.1 million. This year, what did he say? Was that 1.8 million? Sorry, billion. For virtually no benefit to the community. This is disappointing to me, because there's been numerous studies overseas, backed up by studies in Australia, that shows that the way to stop crime is early intervention. One of the key causes of crime is poverty. So if you want to lock up everyone who's poor, then you can do it, but it's a very expensive thing to do. The average cost per prisoner last year was about $120,000 a year per prisoner. I mean, I've always said, why not just pay them $1,000 a week to stay out of trouble, and you'll probably cut the crime and half your budget cost. Because, okay, some people are in jail for really serious crimes, and you're always going to need ways to deal with those people. But an awful lot of people are in for relatively trivial offences. About half the people incarcerated are on remand. In other words, they're waiting to be heard in court. So this is a really expensive exercise. If we could find ways to speed up the legal system, that would save us an awful lot of money. So where does that bring us? Well, in the territory, he quoted a net debt of 12 billion. I had a different number. I had 14 billion, but it wasn't 2 billion between friends. You know, the debt per capita for every person in the territory has risen to nearly 40,000 each. Now, if you want to compare that to other states in the territory, Victoria, which has been criticised locally for terrible debt levels, was about 22,000. And for those that follow these budgets, Victoria's just brought down a surplus budget. In other words, Victoria are combating their debt. What the territory doing? They're driving ahead. They're going to have another 1.5 billion debt. So that debt level will rise to about 46,000 per head. All the other states, Western Australia, Tasmania, Queensland, ACT, they're all under $10,000 per head. So in other words, the territory level of debt is about 4 times the level. And it's getting to the stage where I wonder how sustainable it is. And I'm rather surprised that there's not more questions about the sustainability of this budget and how debt is going to be managed in the long term. Because when I've seen Bill Yan stand up and talk, he talks about, oh, there's going to be growth in the future and it'll all come back with surpluses. But there's no evidence in the budget that that's happening. And we're at risk with the current situation in the world of the world going into recession. You'd all be aware of the current world situation and the cost of energy and fuel. The chance, and you'll also be aware that interest rates are on the rise. That means that paying off that debt is going to become more expensive over the next few years. But it also means that for the territory to be able to pay back that debt, something enormous is going to have to change. And so as a Territorian, I know I'm not in the country at the moment, but I spend half my life in the Territory. I am really concerned that this debt level is not sustainable. That's really all I've got to say, unless there's any questions there.
Thank you so much, Alan. Yeah, and how, like, what kind of economy would work for the Territory is a really significant question, and obviously the different political parties and approaches are dealing with that in very different ways. We have got, I was going to ask Rolf, one further bit of conversation that would be great to have from you is the impact. What is the impact of the federal budget on the Northern Territory? Because that's coming too. How does it relate to what we're seeing here in our Northern Territory budget? Oh, you're on mute. Just a sec. I think you'll need to unmute yourself. There we go. Great. Brilliant. Thank you.
I'll just repeat. I mean, I agree with everything Alan said. If anything, I'm even more pessimistic than him because I think structurally the Territory is unsustainable and there's going to be some huge crisis in, I would guess, about 15 years' time. The Commonwealth budget is important to the Territory for two sources of our funding, if you like. Firstly, the what's called general purpose funding. The Commonwealth gives, and this is basically the collections from the GST. The GST is the Commonwealth tax, but it's as the accountants say, it's hypothecated for distribution to the states. So the Commonwealth collects the tax on behalf of the states. It apportions the money to the states. Now, the apportionment is based on a system of relativities that are determined by the Commonwealth Grants Commission, which is an expert body. Now, since that process started, the Territory position on a per capita basis has deteriorated by about 20-25%. So everybody talks about we get $5.70 or whatever it is per person. Whereas New South Wales only gets 80 cents or 70 cents or whatever. That's true, but as Dayna has evidenced and as Alan has evidenced, we do not have the revenue to maintain the sort of state structure that we've got. So the GST revenue, if you like, you can call it that, the general purpose grant, is usually around about 60 to 65%. of the total money that the territory government gets as revenue. That proportion would have to grow, and it is not going to grow. We've got 2 federal seats, so we are just not a player in that respect. Okay, the second source of money, and this is usually roughly about 20% of our budget, are general purpose grants. And a lot of what Dayna talked about would have been Commonwealth grants administered by the territory. And so a lot of the territory's activities are actually distributing or delivering programs that are virtually funded by the Commonwealth. And traditionally, the Commonwealth gets an enthusiasm about something and decides to do something about fixing it up. I mean, people may remember a couple of years ago there were unrest in Alice Springs, and the Prime Minister flew in and doled out $256 million. So this distribution is partly determined by the Commonwealth, insofar as the Commonwealth funds and we deliver. And a lot of our health and education programs are done that way. And there is constant disputation between the Commonwealth and the territory, because the territory takes too big a proportion of those grants as administration. Now, in the 1990s, it got laughable. Education were charging 40 cents in the dollar to administer a program. And I'll give you a modern illustration. 2012 or 2013, we signed a 5-year Indigenous housing agreement. Commonwealth put in 100 million. We would put in 100 million, but the territory administered the program. So each year it spent the Commonwealth's 100 million. It never spent more than 68 million of its own money. The rest that was in the budget, this highly reputable document, was clawed back into the bureaucracy to fund an excessive bureaucracy. So the importance of the federal budget is as, in a sense, it's the same as it is for ours. Our budget signals that crime and public safety were the predominant, if you like, political agendas of the government, as is their democratic right. They got elected. That was their platform. The Commonwealth will bring down a budget, and if you like, the part of it that affects us is the part that will go into special programs that the states will administer. The Commonwealth will mostly fund, but the states will administer, and that's where the real politics lies. The propensity for the territory to levy too many cents in the dollar to run Commonwealth programs or Commonwealth funded programs is a continuing bugbear. And if we get to the point where if we continue to do that, and it's inevitable we have to because of the structure of our public service, we have to fund the public servants, eventually the Commonwealth will intervene. And we have to forget we are not a sovereign state like the 6 other original states in the Federation. The territory government was created by a Commonwealth Act. So in that sense, it's an instrument of the Commonwealth. And that's why, for instance, Howard could override territory law when he did the intervention. And behind the scenes, the Commonwealth periodically forces the territory to do things they don't want to do, but the Commonwealth has the power to force it. So we have that's the politics of it. The combination of that with our ever-increasing debt, because, as I mentioned before, we've taken the utilities off budget. So, if you like, there's a hidden debt that the Treasurer didn't talk about. We are bound for big problems with the Commonwealth within 2 or 3 years, I would guess, or within 5 minutes of Mr. Albanese getting re-elected.
Gosh, there's so much to this budget discussion. Yeah, it's really, we could go on for hours. I'm just going to keep the last 10 minutes or 9 minutes now for questions. We have got one in the chat already. And that is from Martin asking, how can the debt be reduced? And are there things that could be cut now? Is that even how we do it? Yeah. How could the debt be reduced and what could be cut now? That might be a question for you, Rolf.
Well, as I pointed out, the debt is structural. It's to do with the structure of the way that we organise the territory government, right? The structure of the state, the tasks it has set itself, and the way it organises to accomplish those tasks.
Yeah.
And the fact that the territory is inevitably, for a variety of reasons, underfunded for the tasks that are required. I mean, the true degree of disadvantage in our society and the structure of that disadvantage mean inevitably that we are spending more money and being very inefficient about it.
Can I add something to that?
Yes, great.
Look, I agree with you. We are a lot more dependent on Commonwealth funding than any other state or territory. And one of those areas of funding is the GST funding, which the GST is distributed back. The Commonwealth doesn't keep any of it. They distribute it all back to the states and the territory. Now, this is done on a formula, and the territory has always done very well out of it traditionally because we've got a high level of poverty, we've got long distances, we've got the highest proportion of Indigenous people. There are so many things in the formula that work in our favour. But this was changed significantly back in the Morrison years. And what happened was the Western Australia government started kicking up, saying that they weren't getting enough back. And my recollection was it's just before a West Australian election. So Morrison rejigged the formula. And he took a little bit off of every state and territory, but the damage that was done to the territory was huge. From memory, it was about $1 billion we lost. And we're completely unable to raise any funds. Martin's asked, could we cut programs? Sure, we can always cut programs, but there gets a point where it is very hard without crashing the economy to cut some of these things. And so there is a very political aspect to this, which has not ever been faced up, I think, to. And the politicians don't talk about it. They just run their own agendas.
See, it might be of interest to your audience. One of the reasons that the territory government is pushing the gas industry so hard, even to the extent where you'll notice that they promised to guarantee the loans that Tamboran need for the Shenandoah project, gas project, is because in 2030, Groote Island manganese will shut down and they'll stop exporting uranium oxide from Gove. And those two projects are the largest source of own source revenue that the territory has. So it has to develop an alternative revenue stream. And that's why the previous Labor government, even though it comprised a lot of people who probably thought that investing in a carbon future was not really smart, and you'd be better going solar, in effect they had to because of the financial imperative for the territory. And Alan's right, our long-term position is deteriorating because our own source revenue is not growing as fast as our expenditure. So even if we did nothing, the deficit would go up. We can employ all the accounting tricks we like, but that's an inalienable structural fact about our political economy that we cannot do anything about.
Well, it does seem quite impossible for the Northern Territory to have an independent budget, or this idea about an economy that grows and we become self-sustaining is not realistic. We've got time, I think, for one more question, although we're cutting it fine. Maybe we can just get Dayna, yeah. Elsabie's question here for Dayna. The health funding in the corrections budget seems to also have been reduced. Now, what would be the AMA questions or response to that?
I think that more than speaks for itself. More people in jail and less health services for them in a population that we already know is disadvantaged. The way that they teach us about public health way back in first and second year med school is that they tell us that I can't remember the exact percentage, but a huge percentage of people, of men who are in prison, have hearing impairment. So it starts in childhood with having reduced hearing, and then reduced ability to engage and pay attention at school, and then acting out, and that spirals. And so reduction in health leads to more people in prison. It leads to more people who are unhealthy in prison. And I think that just speaks to the government's priority that they're not funding that. There's also another element. So the funding for the staff or the doctors who work in prison comes through the primary health budget. And so that might be some of that urban primary healthcare spend. I suspect only a small amount of it, but we're currently overdue negotiations for our enterprise agreement for the Northern Territory public medical officers. And one of the big sticking points in the last round of negotiations is that if a GP is working in a remote community, they get a certain amount of incentives, they get revenue activity based payments. And so what you see as the salary of what a doctor gets is often only half of what they actually get. So the salaries look quite low, especially compared to other states and territories, and that's because they have an incredibly complex system that's hard to untangle, that's topped up with allowances and incentive payments and rurality payments and all that kind of stuff. The amount that you get for working in a prison is far less than if you work in primary care in a rural remote area. So you are working in incredibly difficult conditions, underfunded conditions, and you're getting paid less than if you're working in a rural remote community. So we already have a huge challenge in staffing our prisons with doctors because the enterprise agreement is not fit for purpose and does not incentivize working in this area. And now on top of that, we are funding the system even less. So it's a blow to an already failing system, really. Oh, Sarah, I think you've gone on mute.
We're counting the seconds now, down to 8 o'clock. Jess had a question that's how long does 16 million last in the hospital payroll? Do you have a one-word answer for that?
Not long.
Not long. Okay, great. Thanks very, very much to our three speakers, Rolf, Dayna, and Alan. I just think that we need an hour with each of you. So maybe the next webinar needs to be a bit longer. There's so many more questions than answers. So I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't think I'm going to sleep very well because my mind's starting to go with all this extra information. In a good way, I mean. And so just to close off, Voices of the Top End will be continuing to do webinars and have further events. There is urgency, I guess. We've got two elections on the horizon in 2028. It's not that long away, and we need all the help we can get. In the more immediate right now future, this week, the budget is being debated again in Parliament. So if you're interested in how it's being talked, how that conversation goes, you can go into Parliament this week or listen into it. And estimates are in June, and there's just before that, like the early June, there'll be the estimates hearings, and that's really the chance to be asking very pointed, specific questions. And so get in touch with your local MLAs to ask those questions. They can ask on your behalf. And I also encourage us all to be writing emails to the ministers and to our MLAs. Our staffers do count the emails as well, and that it's assumed that one email is worth, several more. So, and it can force some review of elements. Okay, but thank you, Louise, for organising this, and also to Jackie for doing the tech. And thanks again to our 3 speakers, and of course to all of you for being here. I'm sure we'll see you very soon.
Thank you.
All right. Ciao, ciao, everyone.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.